Hello and welcome to the Revo Business Battles and Industry Insight Chats. Grab a coffee and settle in, as today I have the privilege of talking to Laura, an all-round great person with a different view on things, creative and owner of a specialty design business with a side hustle to boot. So let's get stuck into it. Laura, how do you describe what you do now with Creative Jam, and why do you call yourself a creative specialist for the FMCG industry rather than just a designer?
Well, I've been working with food and beverage packaging brands for the last 12 or so years, and it's a bit of an interesting story with where I started. I am visually impaired, and when I left university, I looked for work and I found it really tricky to find work with having a disability. All of the I guess the judgments are alive and well. We were in New Zealand, unfortunately, still, and I had been around business my whole life. And so I thought, well, if I'm not going to get a job, then I'm going to create one for myself. And the very first company that I started doing some design work for was Oob Organic. If you don't know them, they do frozen fruits, frozen veggies, and ice blocks and things like that. I discovered that I really enjoyed putting things onto boxes and packaging, and because the industry itself is everybody knows everybody, I got from one client to another, and I started to realize that this was actually the kind of design that I really enjoyed. And I've always referenced it as saying, this is my jam, which is how Creative Jam was born. And I knew that if I was going to sort of be seen as an expert, I was going to have to sort of play that long before I ever felt like I was one. And so I started to understand that when you're designing packaging, there's so much more than just making it look nice that's needed. You need to understand barcodes. You need to understand the shelf that it's going on. You need to understand, like who we're speaking to and where things need to go. And there's a lot of regulations, that sort of have to fit under the Food Standards Authority for New Zealand. And so the reason that I have called myself a creative consultant for CPG and FMCG was that being a designer in this space is not enough. You need to be more than just that. And I have a background in writing as well as design and photography. I come from a really creative family, and so I feel like I'm more than just a designer these days. I spend a lot of time working with SMEs that are kind of getting into that space that want to look at being in retail. And so to do that, to position myself in the place to sort of speak to these people, then being a creative consultant was kind of the right terminology for it.
It's very rounded in your approach to it, with everything you're looking at, covering all of those aspects of it. And with the barcoding and stuff you mentioned, I'm putting my hat on for that. I remember doing that when I was printing, doing a barcode verification course, and it was like a week-long course going through understanding how barcodes worked. I don't know, it's probably way different now because that was many moons ago, of course. But yeah, rather interesting. So you sort of, going on to that, you sort of mentioned there about you being visually impaired. So how's that shaped your approach, I guess, to shelf impact and packaging design? Is there anything different that you do based around the needs or anything like that you're sort of thinking about a different community approach to it versus just the everyday Joe public?
There's definitely a lot of things that come to mind when I can think about I try not to call it a disability, because for me I've always seen it as being an ability, because obviously relying on a lot of other senses other than just being something visual. And packaging has to be more than just a visual experience as well. We think about the tactile nature of a pouch or a box, or having some kind of special embellishment like a beautiful foil or a spot gloss or whatever all of the wonderful things that you can do with packaging. And also remembering that we don't buy products, we buy experiences, we buy with emotion, we buy from people. So telling a story when you're talking about a food and beverage brand and packaging is really important. And I think my specialty is because I've had to build my own story and, jump through a few windows when doors were closed on me. It's become a bit of a specialty for me for really understanding, what people are saying by just listening to them. What I do with a new client, whenever I get a new client, is I'll actually just let them tell me their story and what it is, how they got to where they are and where they want to go with their brand. And that can actually provide a lot of insight for me into what I need to build into their packaging design so that they can sell it better themselves. Because a lot of people, a lot of design is like, focused towards how the customer's going to feel. But if you don't build in the story of the founder into that, you can miss those really important emotional touch points. And I think having a disability has really helped me hone in on that emotional connection that brands would have. And I think the important thing when you're in a supermarket and you're going and you're looking at the packaging, a founder is not there to tell the story. We cannot have a million founders standing next to each shelf, telling them to buy their product. The supermarket would be way more busy than it is now if we did that. So the packaging has to speak that for them. And really the brands that do the best are the ones that have a really good story behind them.
That's 100% the truth. And a lot of people actually miss that, not in their brand briefs, I find. With when they come to you or any designer or any sort of creative that they're looking for that process, they've already got, quite often they have a preconceived idea that they've decided amongst their family, their work crew, or what have you, that they come with. So, again, I think you've probably sort of answered this, but from your perspective, what makes a brand stand out on the shelf today, especially in that supermarket environment? Because it's busy, it's hectic, there's a lot of brands out there. There's not new brands every day that are coming up with some different strategy, a new product, where there's a lot of followers or similar tos. So what do you think that is?
This is the most important question when coming and creating a new brand. And there's that age-old saying of nothing is intrinsically new. Everything is just a recreation of something else, which I think is true in some ways. But I think that the great thing about the capability of this thing up here, this brain that we use all the time, is that it can come up with new solutions over and over and over again. The most important thing, obviously, is the story. But one thing that I love to do is anytime I get a new product, I like to go and stand in the supermarket and look in that particular category. And I like to see what's there, what's missing. Are there any colors missing? Are there any shapes missing? Is everybody using the same kind of packaging? And why is that, or why isn't that? And that's a really powerful tool to have, because when you go and you look and you see why someone is let's just say, why are there 12 different cereal brands that are using a box with a flow wrap plastic inside? Is there some reason why that is? And can we give them something different? And maybe it's just a really nice pouch. Maybe it's a tin. What can we use that will tick all of the things that are required when coming up with a brand that is focused on retail? So we've got a beautiful story. We've got the unique selling points, which aren't crazy and overloading the front of the pack. We've looked at what's on shelf and what's not on shelf, from things like color and packaging kind and things like that. And then how does that then react to things like shipping? How does that react to it? What the supermarkets want? Because whether we like it or not, they have some say. And then how expensive is that to do? So there's some really important factors with standing out on shelf these days. It's not enough just to come up with a new brand of granola. There's a lot more that needs to go in. And I think that, there's positives and negatives to that. The positives is that we live in a country where even with a relatively small market, Kiwis are actually really good at trying new things. We're really good at getting on board with matcha or getting on board with a different toothpaste. We'll actually put that brand loyalty aside if it speaks to us in a way that we understand. And that obviously comes back to that story. Obviously, having a small market is, is hard to kind of get cut through. So there's positives and negatives to that. But I do love the fact that in New Zealand, like, we're keen to try new things all the time.
Because you're sort of looking at from a whole holistic view, which is fantastic, because a lot of places, again, as I said, I feel like sometimes that's missed. And maybe that's just because, there's we do run in New Zealand, someone said to me the other day that the average New Zealand food business, excluding the large conglomerate companies we have, and then that like larger sort of large area of big brands, that the average food company in New Zealand is 4 people. And I was like, whoa, and this is statistically, they said it's 4 people, which is quite crazy. So you sort of, you go, how do they actually get that next thing, but they work on a shoestring budget, run on the smell of an oily rag, because, with a small startup founders operations trying to do things right. So I guess, coming to yourself gives them that whole holistic view to be able to look at it. So sort of carrying on from that, and you've said, the story's quite key. You've worked with from a wide range of categories, multiple brands. So how does the design process change when you're working with a small startup to a large established brand or a more established brand? Is budget sort of one of the first things talked about when we sort of talk that smell of an oily rag running? Or how do you sort of, is there any difference, or is it the same sort of model based on what they require?
It's interesting when you talk about budget, because both, even larger businesses, are still concerned with budget, and they may have a lot more to put in, but remembering that their scale of how many units that they are actually producing is a lot more than somebody that is producing a small amount for their first run. So there's still budget constraints on both sides of the coin. Obviously, one coin is a little bit larger than the other. But if I think about the small, startup brands, obviously anybody getting into food knows that it's not an easy task, and it's not a cheap task at all. So most, if not all, the people that I start work with, the conversation doesn't really start with budgets, because they know that this is a large investment up front. And I have specific ways of being able to make things affordable for people who are startups, because I really enjoy working with the startup brands. I really enjoy working with them because often their briefs are more open. You do need to spend a lot more time working with them on actually honing in who they're speaking to, because quite often when you come from being a consumer and you jump onto the other side of the table, you might consider that you want to speak to 18 to 35-year-olds and realizing, and then I will have to kind of bring that back and say that actually an 18-year-old is going to speak and listen very differently to what a 35-year-old is, because they have different wants and needs. Whereas if you're working with a large brand, they'll obviously have spent quite a lot of time working on who their target market is, because that's a language and an area that they're used to. But when it comes to things like budget, I do find everybody is facing the same challenges. Are they buying packaging for overseas? Whereas somebody like a new startup is going to be concerned about MOQs, because we know when you're buying things from overseas, there's MOQs to hit, or they won't look at you at all. But then the people who are a larger business, if they're buying packaging from overseas, they're obviously going to have much, much higher shipping costs. And as you know, at the moment, shipping costs are equal to a third or half of what the production cost is. And so if you're a large person and you're importing 30,000 pouches, obviously your price is going to be just as eye-watering as somebody that's ordering 1,000 for their first run. So there's actually, at the moment, in the present space that we're in, when we have the conversations around budget, they're both looking for the same thing. They're both looking for ways to maximize the look and feel, making it look really cool, and speak the way that it should be spoken about. But they're all looking for ways in which they can maximize on that kind of economy of scale by how, are they putting labels on? Are they getting 1,000 of the same color pouch, and then are they doing labels on for each SKU? Or, they're all looking for the same things, regardless for whether they're large or small. But the conversations where the conversations differ is around that, the difference between knowing what a target market is and then sort of starting out, and somebody that's starting out that needs to trademark, that needs to understand how the process works. As far as my process is concerned, from a big brand to a small brand, it's relatively the same. I've got a process that I've worked on for a long time, and it seems to work pretty well, whether it's big or small.
I guess right on point, because you're right, with the big or small brands, they still want the same outcome, don't they? They're still looking for a product that, as you said, speaks to their demographic and, or their target market, and the small companies just don't know what that is. And, like yourself, I also like working with the smaller companies, because it feels like, you're really helping someone get their foot up. And, again, New Zealand's built on small and medium businesses, so it's really cool. We have a lot of those that we actually work with. You've got that other, doing the advertising part of uni first, it's giving you that different aspect and way of looking at it. So that's actually quite cool. So, moving on from that, it's like just sort of now talking about some with the branding and changes to it. Is there sort of a project that you've worked on where a small packaging change has been like given the results well and truly above what you sort of expected?
I guess there are two that come to mind. The first one is Milu Beauty, and so that is a beauty brand that we came up with I think it's 2 years ago now. And she was very adamant that she wanted this brand to be inclusive. And there are no beauty brands in Australasia, well, at the time, that were thinking around the fact that even people who are visually impaired or blind still need to have a beautiful looking face and use moisturizer and things like that. So the small change that we made that had a massive impact was we included Braille on the packaging, which was a really tricky process. Even though I'm visually impaired, I don't speak or use Braille, but I am a member of the New Zealand Foundation for the Blind, and so I was able to contact them and say, like, these are the words that we want to put on the packaging, and they were just overjoyed that that's what we were doing. And it's made a big difference, because even for people that don't use Braille or are visually impaired, it had an impact in understanding that this brand was inclusive, and it was thinking above what brands were thinking of at the time. And, that sort of comes back to that conversation that we were having earlier about, at the shelf, what are people doing differently? And even if you don't use Braille yourself, most people know what it is, and so can feel comfortable around that brand because they know that they've actually put the effort in to be inclusive to everybody, which is the emotional need of women. We want to be inclusive, so it was a small thing that would have, and look, it added on to their cost of printing their boxes, because it's classed as a special element. It's embossed into the box itself, so there was, there's an added cost in that, but it fit with what the brand was trying to be, so that embellishment became part of the brand story, and therefore it was justifiable to do that. There is a pouch brand that we did, which was a supplement for the UK, and everybody knows when you have a pouch that is a supplement, you have a scoop, and generally that scoop sits at the bottom of the pouch, and you have to get a spoon and you have to dig down to get that scoop. So we actually found a way to pop that scoop, like tuck it into one side of the pouch at the top, so with the powder went in, and then the scoop had a little bit of, that sticky glue kind of stuff that was popped against the side of the pouch on the inside, in a place that sat at the top of the part of the scoop, so it was like quite far away from the powder, so it was very rare that the powder actually kind of got onto that glue, and it worked really well. Because people were actually saying, oh my god, yay, we can actually still have a scoop but it's not having to dig down, and you don't end up losing half the powder, and it's not all caked inside the scoop, and something so small. And again, that was an extra piece of the line. So whenever you're adding on an extra element to your production, anytime there's a different touch point, whether it's a embellishment like the braille, or whether it's a human putting a scoop onto the inside of every pouch, there's cost involved with that. But if it fits into your, into those brand pillars, and this one did, because it was the annoyance and the time factor of, finding that scoop. And it may seem like such a small thing, but anybody that use powdered supplements in any way finds that the most frustrating thing in the world. Because when you're, in the morning and you're making your smoothie or something like that, you don't have a lot of time to go and search for that scoop and dig your hand in, and you could probably lose quite a lot of powder just by it going on your hands, and then you dusting it off on your clothes and things like that. So it's the little tiny things that's why it's so important to when you're thinking about a brand, to think about everything. Nothing is silly, nothing is off limits.
And I know, understanding the process of manufacture, that was going to cost more, so it's really cool that, brands are actually putting their neck out there to actually do it, spend the extra money and go, actually, it's because it's part of our ethos, we're doing it. That is impressive. And again, that scoop one, I'm like, I know exactly what you mean, because it's just any scoop in any product, whether it be, washing powder, blah, 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 blah. If they don't actually have them, most of them don't have them anymore, for the environmental claim. So you sort of miss that. But exactly, annoyance 101, finding those scoops. So that is fantastic. All right, so let's change gears a bit and sort of work from this little side hustle you have, from designer to brand owner. You run your own brand, you launched it in 2024. What inspired you to sort of go into something of your own? And I hope you didn't charge yourself too much to do the design.
I charge myself absolute maximum dollar to do my own brand. So I'm lucky I can afford me. I know the boss, so I managed to get a good deal. So SneekiCo is something that I had thought about since I became a parent. And for many years, everybody had said to me around me, like, oh, why don't you start your own thing? And I had my response for many years was, I'm not that crazy. But there came a time when we had a little bit of an investment to cash up, and so my husband said to me, look, if you want to do it now, you do it now, and which is wonderful to have that support. And I have a 6-year-old son, 6.5 to him if you ask him, and he is a fussy eater, and I was a fussy eater growing up. And so knowing that a big pain point for parents is not just getting fruits and vegetables into young kids, but also the amount of junk and snacks and things in supermarkets masquerading as being healthy was getting to me. And luckily for me, 99% of the work that I work with is health related, and by choice, those are the people that I like to work with. But when I started to learn about what was actually going into products and how, like, the exposure that I had to food technologists and how the regulatory system worked, and of course how people were getting around it, and I'll put my hand up and say I've been privy to that, because I know what words can be said to twist the lines a little bit. For example, lower sugar versus low sugar. Low sugar has a direct claim in the Food Standards Authority, as lower sugar does not. And so there were so many things that I was picking up and reading the back of labels, and I was like, I just don't want to feed this to my son. So how can I, basically kill two birds with one stone, is get him more fruits and vegetables and get more goodness into his lunchbox, which is the meal which parents have the least control over. That goes to school and they eat whatever they want to eat. And so I thought, well, my love of food and my love of baking in my spare time, another creative outlet, I was like, I'm just going to combine everything. And so that's how SneekiCo was born. And it took me about a year to come up with the first 3 recipes, which is a chocolate muffin that's got beetroot and blueberries in it, a pumpkin and apple pancake, and a kumara and chocolate chip muesli bar. And they're all a dry mix, because dry mixes are a relatively good entry product into New Zealand to do, because they're shelf stable and all of that stuff. But and it was one that I could make at home. It was one that I could do a lot of benchtop testing, work with the food techs and, contacts and people that I knew to kind of test stuff out. And then come to the fun part and being my own, writing my brief for me, which was tricky. It really was, because, I didn't have anybody to bounce the ideas off. I wasn't dealing with somebody else's brain or somebody else's idea. It was intrinsically mine. So it was very internal. But I did find it flowed really well, because I was able to kind of internalize that process, that design process. And there actually had been a font that I had been sitting on for years that I was like, I'm going to use that one day and I'm going to use it for me. So I had my chance to do so. But the great thing about SneekiCo is that I've been able to, I guess, use the support network, which I had spent so many years cultivating in the industry, referrals backwards and forwards with people, and many people were keen to help with advice, because I put so much emphasis on building relationships here, that it was so wonderful to get that support back from people to be able to launch it. And it's also been the most wonderful moment to see that all of the work that I had put into clients actually worked. Like, I could see it firsthand. Everything that I had been telling people for years wasn't a lie. It wasn't something I made up. It was, it was actually working, because people are buying. And after the first year of having it around, I've managed to. It's now stocked in Faro, and we survived our 13-week trial, and so it's now a fully fledged member of their their supplier network, and we've got more coming. So
that first meeting with yourself, going, okay, what do I do? How do I do it? You sort of said internalizing that, because you're right, there's no one to bounce that main primary part off. And fantastic using your network. That's brilliant, because that is, like, I feel in New Zealand now, melting pot, that is our key. People like helping people here, especially good people, that you work together, and we actually do that. It's quite unique, I find, in some ways. Maybe it's not, I don't know what goes on in other countries, but I feel that it was just like this unique environment that we live in, and this community sort of focus we have. So it's really good that sort of worked for you with your brand there. So with, being that brand owner, has that changed anything in what you do for the design for your clients? Sort of like you said, internalizing it, you're probably speaking to yourself about how this is going to work. Has it, made you become more vigorous, more, more critical, more empathetic, or all three, or both, or two of those, or anything else that's sort of come out from doing it yourself?
I think it's made me sympathize with people a lot more. But it's changed immensely. It's just added to that process that I have had for such a long time, and really step into that creative consultant kind of a position. And I'm a firm believer in actually, being the person you want to be long before you believe it yourself, because you can live off determination long before you have any belief in what you're doing. And so I was really I'm just gonna, I'm gonna be this creative consultant. But it wasn't until I started SneekiCo that I probably really realized how much I knew about the industry, more than just good design. And the thing that I like the most is, because I work with so many startups, I'm able to help them so much more than just making pretty packaging. because as you know, we, like this industry, it is small and it's wonderful and it's connected, but you cannot Google anything when it comes to FMCG. There are some wonderful courses out there that have come to light in New Zealand and Australia. Rise with Rebecca is an amazing one, and then obviously Seed Lab in Australia, and then Foodpreneurs is an incredible festival for Australasia. But there, you can't Google any of it. And so when I realized that like people were coming to me and going, oh, I've never trademarked a product before, I was like, I know how to do that because I've been through that. And so it was the relatability that I think has been really key as well, because I've been able to go, and someone's come to me and said, oh, I need to get a national program certificate to be able to have my food at home. How do I go about that? I go, I can do that. I can put my hand up and I go, I know how to do that. So it becomes much more of a, I guess, a circular experience for me, and I was born to help people. I love helping people. So I get a real kick out of using SneekiCo as a vehicle for me to go to test things within reason, because, I've still got to make money and it's still a business and it's still got to have its thing. But it's the ability to now pull some of that across to Creative Jam and go, oh, yep, that is something that you will need to do. This is how you do it. Is a pretty cool thing, and it's a very unique place that I think it puts me.
You sit on both sides of it, so you understand the process of getting it into store as well. And I think that is something that a lot of people miss. They come up with a great brand and they feel it's going to work because everybody in their family, everybody in their small business, what have you, says the product tastes good, it's great, but then they don't have that part of it by getting it into store, so that again you can pass on those insights, which is so amazing, because that is again unique. Someone said to me that New Zealand does have that uniqueness as well, where someone will definitely know a category manager or a store owner or one of the big bosses of the supermarkets or the retail trade line you're trying to get into, which is probably true. That 6 degrees of separation is 2 in New Zealand, as we know. So that's quite cool. So when you talk about, SneekiCo, what's been the biggest surprise you've had with it? Well, if once it hit the shelf, things you thought that, wouldn't matter, did matter. Again, you've got a different hat on to other brand owners going into this because you've seen what other ones work. So what's the biggest surprise from it once it hit the shelf?
One's a surprise and one was a shock. The first one was, the surprise for me was just how different each product would perform in a different space. As an example, one of my products does way better in faro than the other two do but in another instance, hang on, I'm going to start again because there's a better way to say that. One of the surprises that I have found is that the products themselves perform very differently where they're being sold. Like in faro, one of my products does better than what it does in a Shopify sense, whereas another product does really well when I'm there to sell it in person and to actually taste it. So you can have all the most wonderful insights and go, okay, cool, this pancakes does really well online, so I'm going to buy a little bit more of that when I plan for my production run. And then have the muffins do really well in a retail setting. It's so interesting how it's different everywhere. And you, like I said, you can plan for every kind of situation, but the people that buy it will dictate how that flows out, how that plays out for you. And I think that is really interesting. The second, thing for me, the surprise is I didn't realize how quickly the opportunities can come, but then how slowly they can progress once that opportunity has come in. For example, when you're thinking about in a retail sense, there's a lot of regulatory things, little regulatory hurdles that must be crossed before you reach a shelf. And so you might get a yes from somebody, but you might not actually land on shelf for another 3 months because of all of the things all the boxes you've got to tick. So it's not It's not fast moving consumable goods. The only part that's fast about it is like is how much money goes out. No, I shouldn't say that, but like is how how fast it can grow and how slow it can grow at the same time. And so having a business like Creative Jam, which in itself is a teenage business now because it's been around for a long time, versus SneekiCo, which was very new for me, I think I struggled on a personal level with having something that intrinsically just ran itself and did well, whereas one that still needs a lot of nurturing. It's still a baby. And so the differences between the two were hard. The biggest part for me was the biggest challenge for me with SneekiCo was the fact that I'm not a natural numbers person. Being a creative person, the one part of my brain significantly outweighs the other when it comes. So for me, the numbers part is not something that's natural. So I've had to spend a lot of time getting used to the commercials, knowing my numbers. And one habit that I've got myself into is looking at zero every morning before I do anything else, because it is a way for me to get comfortable with looking at the numbers, even if I've had to build in really pretty design spreadsheets because my brain would like take things in a visual way rather than a numbers way. Is that's probably the biggest challenge for me, as the commercial side of things is very different to the commercial sides of running a service business like Creative Jam.
I know exactly what you mean with the numbers side of it, because that's one thing that I've always had troubles with myself. Looking at numbers, I just say, oh my God, no way, I don't want to get into that. But it's critical. You actually mentioned it right back in the get-go. And one of the discussions you're having there is about the brand. You said, know your numbers. And so it's quite, critical here when you mention it again in your own brand, that it's know your numbers. And I think that again, and you talked about money going out the door is the fast part of the FMCG. And yeah, that's true. I've seen that as well with a lot of different businesses I've worked with over the years.
You're right about knowing your numbers. Knowing your numbers is a very, very important thing. And there are a lot of different numbers to know when you're doing this business. So I think if you don't know what they are, like obviously your cost of goods is the most important one. You need to know how much it's costing you to make it. But also like do some research, use some AI, do some research and actually find out how many people there are in New Zealand in your target market. Because what a conversation that I tend to have with people is, particularly people that are going into beverage, because beverage is a really, it's a pretty busy market. Kiwis love a good drink. And so I like to have the conversation with people around, yes, we're a team of 5 million, but of that 5 million, and I like to break it down and say, well, actually, you've got only this many that are actually going to buy your drink. And then you've got over, I'm going to say on average, maybe 600 different types of beverages in say your average New World that people can purchase. So, like break it down into the facts. And so you really understand who you're actually speaking to outside of just knowing your financial numbers. If I speak in a way of SneekiCo, in the North Island, there is apparently like 66,000 kids that are of the age bracket that I'm talking to. And of that, like so many of those are possibly not going to be able to afford, like families where they won't be able to afford my product. So I go, wow, okay, I now know how many people I've got to buy my product. And that can be a really powerful thing because it's finite. So yes, I'm not a natural numbers person in the regards of like 20 times 5,000 and like 0.5% per, blah, blah, like that. But when I've got finite numbers from a sales perspective, it's really, really powerful, because you can go, when somebody new buys a product off your website, or you get your sales number from a retailer, you can go, woohoo, I'm now selling to 3,000 people. That's only 37,000 people to go.
Yeah, that's actually a different viewpoint of looking at the numbers, because I think a lot of people just, as you said, numbers, they look at the numbers of their cost of goods, what they're spending on this, how that all impacts into their cost of goods. So looking at where their market is and their target market is actually quite impressive, because you then can drill it down, as you say, and get to that finite number. But where do you get that data? That's the biggest thing, because everyone says big data is key, big data is key, data is key, data is key. We've said it, your numbers, but where do you get that information? Who do you turn to? Are there people, that you can recommend? Maybe they can be another person in the hot seat like yourself.
Use AI. It is a tool, and as a designer, it says funny to say use AI, but there are so many benefits that actually come from having these tools that we have now. ChatGPT, you can ask things like how many alcoholic drinkers are there in the people born in between the years 2000 and 2026. Like, you can ask it really random things, and it will pull from census, it will pull from everything that it can, and that's a really, that's obviously going to be an estimate, but an estimate's better than like just a broad number. Obviously, you can get scan data. It's very expensive to buy from supermarkets, and for the most part, it's valuable stuff, because especially if you're going to go and do tastings, you want to know when most of the families are going to be in store and things like that. But though that's kind of like a lot of that scan data is reserved for bigger brands. But if you are starting out, use some AI, talk to people, use SneekiBeak. SneekiBeak is an amazing resource if you're starting out, because it's consumer testing of 100 to 200 people that you can hone in to be who you think your target market is, and you get the results within 48 hours, and it's super affordable. And it's good for testing packaging and ideas before you sink all of that cash into it. So those are some really good resources. Don't be afraid to talk to other brands as well. I've got 2 or 3 other like baking mix brands, and we're all friends, and we all have our products in the similar retailers. So whenever I go into store, I'll check how many numbers she's got on shelf, and she'll do the same for me. So like, most people are really, really helpful, and LinkedIn is an amazing space for us for food and beverage, and it is because you can just go in there and you can say, I need somebody who's an event specialist. I need somebody that can help me figure out where I find this number. So there are plenty of resources out there. You just you just gotta use the grey matter and have a think about what's available to you and your budget.
Because I worked for a brand previously. I had a stint out of the packaging industry and worked for a FMCG business, and we purchased that scan data, looked at it, and as we were looking at this new market that we were developing not a new market, it was an existing market, but we were entering that market, and it was actually very impressive, and that helped with that positioning of our taste testing promos, etc., at the different stores, the right stores that suited what we were targeting, etc., etc. But you're right, I remember it was expensive. So it's a tough one, but yeah, AI changes the fact of it, so it does make it easier. And I've even heard of some people that have got good relationships with category managers, getting some insights from them, not actual data, but just some insights from those guys, girls that work already in it. Also other relationships with category managers that have, been able to say, hey, we're in this category, but this is what we hear from other people. So, and again, I think that comes down to that whole community way of New Zealand. And you mentioned that with, like, on LinkedIn, you put out there, I've put posts out, does anyone know where I can find a XYZ or something? I've got a customer here that's looking for this. Can anyone help me? I'm looking for a toll processor that can pack this. And there's always people come back to you on it, and it's because we have that helpful nature of it and doing stuff, Is there anything that you can recommend that people do? Is there anything extra and above that people can do for their packaging in any way to actually improve things and make it more inclusive?
Don't use really small fonts. I think that because we live in a world where there are lots of regulatory things that we need to put on in a design way, like the invention of having 2D barcodes is going to be revolutionary for packaging, because the standard QR code only needs to be about, I think it's like 14 mils squared, whereas barcodes, as you know, with GS1 are large and very, very specific on the size they need to be. So I think 2D barcodes are really going to help because you can use it for multiple things. So I would hope that any app developers out there might consider building something around that, around those 2D barcodes, and use them in a way that could create some a talking book around how to use the packaging, and will actually read things out live for people that are visually impaired. So that's something I really hope for. As far as things that can be done in the foreseeable future, I think just be mindful about how busy you make packets, and think about the choices of how small fonts are, because nutritional information and things is actually really, really important if you're health conscious, and often the back of pack can be an afterthought when it comes to design, and most people will go, oh, there's so much regulatory stuff, I'm just not even going to bother. When to be honest, doing the backs of packs is actually one of my favorite things. I like to call it Tetris, because it's very much like a game of Tetris. You have to fit everything and it looks really nicely. And with relation to, you know, the reason why I started SneekiCo as well, is that I want more people to look at the back of packet and actually feel comfortable with understanding it. And so I'm really keen on putting the effort into designing the back side of the pack for it to be really easy to understand and really easy for people to get, whether you're visually impaired or not. But a clued up consumer who knows what to look for is going to make way better choices for their family. And realistically, the only way to do that is to train people to turn it over and look. And so as a designer, it's our responsibility to actually play that game of Tetris and win the game.
Being a printer by trade myself, it's like, I remember some of the fonts we used to get, and they, you know, everything was bigger, and then it started getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And, you know, you're trying to, you know, make sure the ink's working properly, it's not filling in. And you just be like, oh my god, these are so small. You have the, you know, barcodes came along on certain products as well, because they were different before. You know, it was just a label stuck on there with the price on it. You know, there was no barcode. The person used to just tap the number in at the supermarket. You know, then that was the next revolution. It came along, and then more and more information going on those packs, especially, as you say, for these regulatory requirements. And if someone's got an export product as well, it lifts that next level, because they may not do specific packaging for that market. They may have a ANZ, a New Zealand, UK one, or a European, or if they're going into somewhere like the UAE or into those into the Middle East, they then have to have another language on there as well. So, you know, multi-language. I mean, I know, looking at some wine bottle labels as an example, it's like the back of pack on those, I'm just like, wow, that's, you know, there's not that much real estate, and there's a lot of stuff in there. And, you know, you talked before, or we've talked about it several times, the story, and people are telling their story with their packaging. It's that way that people see it. So you're right, that font size is crazy, and it just makes it tough. You're right, for anybody. You know, I wear these now, and because, you know, even with some of the small font, I'm still at arm's length now going, whoa, how do I read that? You know, it looks great on the screen when I'm looking at the design work that's coming through, but yeah, that fonts can be painful. So is there other, you know, other simple design choices that can make a pack stand out differently versus compromising aesthetics of it? Is there any thought around that? You know, you talk tactile. Is there any sort of stuff around that? You know, let's go specifically in flexibles. So your pouches. What are your thoughts around any of those? Are they...
Pouches are great. I actually really like pouches as a medium, because generally you actually have quite a lot of space on each side to print on, which is awesome for a designer. And so I think there are things that you can do, like just making sure that everything has some breathing room, making sure that, you know, the logo's nice and visible, checking that all of the information is not crowded. Interestingly, when you talk about different markets, and particularly things like the US and the UAE, and that it does become tricky when you have to include different languages. And then you look at people who are highly regulated, like the US and Canada. Canada is the worst out of all of them. I have Canadian family, so sorry to them, but you know, like their regulatory stuff is really hard, and so you know, their sort of font choices and things, you are restricted to things like that. But I think the main thing when we're talking about flexibles is understanding how the materials work. So creating more contrast, like if you've got something on screen and you're using, say, an orange and a brown, just making sure that there's nice amount of contrast, like bump up the brights and darken the darks a little bit more, because as you know, there's ink seepage, like it actually, you know, like soaks into the material, especially if you're using a matte pouch, which is my personal favorite. But just understanding as a designer, like remembering that most clients will not know that until they see a physical proof. And so just being really aware of actually how things work as a designer, and making sure that you're just not overcrowding stuff is really important.
That Tetris and getting stuff in there, even though it's a pouch, same scenario. Do you have a personal favorite of like the style of pouch, whether it be a stand-up, the box-sided pouch, or just a flat pouch? Is there anything there that sort of you go, that's the one that everyone should be using?
I have a personal favorite. The ones that I love to design on the most are like the box pouch with the roll top on them. I just think they look so nice. And you know, like the other thing about it is you do get the opportunity to sort of have a little bit of side, like, you know, print on the sides of them. So that's really nice. But from a commercial perspective, I do like your standard stand-up pouch with the zip top on them, because they are just the most, like, they're super economical if you're a small to medium brand. They react well to heat and to temperature, and they can be pretty well moisture wicking if you've got a really like if you've got a really hygroscopic product. They're pretty forgiving as well. If they're being chucked around in an NZ Post satchel by the courier, they're pretty forgiving. By the materials wise, and probably the best thing about pouches is that they're really accessible in New Zealand. You don't typically have to go overseas. You can work with local people to get what and that's what I think is really cool about it, is that, and they're really universal, like for so many different categories. And the color works really well. If you use a good supplier, they just look really, really bright and colorful. And I'm all about the bright and colorfulness. So, and the one thing I do like about it is you can create a little bit of an Easter egg on the bottom of the pouch, the stand-up pouch. On the bottom of all of my SneekiCo pouches, there's a picture of a carrot. So it kind of goes with that hidden vegetables thing. So if somebody picks the pouch up and looks underneath it, they've found the hidden vegetables. So, you know, there's a nice little, I guess, brand additives that you can add to stand-up pouches, which I love.
You know, from the box pouches seem to be the new sort of, that's where a lot more are moving. You know, stand-ups have been around for a long time, and it is that box pouch for the real estate, for the extra printing. So I guess maybe it's taking away that Tetris needed on the back of a stand-up pouch, which is quite cool. But yeah, you're right. Stand-up pouches, I think, is where it's at myself as well. They're my favorite, and yes, more cost-effective too. What's some advice you have for brands and founders, for a brand owner or founder thinking about their packaging design? What are the first 3 things that you think they should get sorted before they come and talk to you?
Because it is a very long process to get the trademark, and often people will do the company's office set up that and their websites before they do the trademark. Please go onto iPons and check that you can have your name before you do anything else. And if you don't have a name, then talk to somebody like me or the Namery or somebody like that who can actually go through that process with you, because it's a long process to be able to do that. That is the very first thing that I ask people. The second thing is understand that it is okay, and most designers will hate me saying this, it is okay to create visuals with AI to start with. It's okay to do that, because what it realistically does for me, it gives me an idea of what they see at the end, and knowing that I can do absolutely 10 times better than what an AI can come up with, because I have, a lot of other thought processes involved around, all of the industry things. But understand that it's okay. I will accept somebody who will show me something they've come up with AI, and then I'll say, cool, let's make that better. Because up until this point in time, most people would come and be really nervous around the creative side of things and be like, oh, I don't have a creative bone in my body. I don't know what I want. I know what I like, but I don't know what I want. And so at least AI has given us as designers a very small starter window into what people are actually looking for. And so I'm okay with that. If people want to do that. So don't feel afraid to use the tools that you have when you don't have a designer yet. But always make the mood board as well. It really helps with that. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is come with an open mind and be ready to be, I guess, challenged not just by me, but by the customers on where you think you are going to go in the market. And just make the process really fluid, and we'll make it fun, and I will bring you along for the journey. This is not a dump it with your designer and let them do everything scenario. This is you will come along for the creative journey with me, because it's important that you have a brand that you understand when I hand it over to you and you go out into the big bad world.
You're working with your person that's going to be making the product, putting it together, your co-packer or whatever it is. You're in that last bit. That's the sprint, I reckon. You've got that final bit, the last 20 meters, I reckon, where you're trying to get it to the store. You got that deadline going, tick, 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 and then you are bolting. But you're right, it's a marathon. So one sort of last thing on packaging design. What's one myth that you think about packaging design that you'd like to debunk as a designer? AKA, the prettier the pack, the better it'll sell.
I think that one of the myths is that packaging design will sell your product, and that is not true. Packaging design will not sell your product. You sell your product. Good packaging design will help you. It will help tell your story when you're not there. As I said, it does the job when you're not there. But the brand and who you speak to and how many hours you put into it are the things which will really rocket it. As I said, when I talk about Debunking, it's a unicorn brand. Yes, it has really good design, and even through the amount of people that it's been through since I designed it, it still looks the same, which is the power of a good brand. But it is not the be all and end all. You cannot just create something really nice and have it win awards and in the design world and put it on a shelf and just go, okay, let the dollars roll in, because it doesn't work that way. So packaging design does not sell products on its own. You have to put the effort in around it. That's probably one of the biggest myths that people come into this with. And then the other myth is that once you design packaging and it's done, that's the last iteration, and you now can sit on that packaging for the next 3 years. That is also not true. The big thing is that you will continue to hone in on it and change your unique selling points. You might even need to adapt it based on the changing needs in your target market. You might have a supplier that goes, to one of your ingredients that no longer stocks that product, and then all of a sudden, you've got to find someone else, and you have to retake the photo of that product, which is what happened with me with something with SneekiCo. So you now have to, get new packaging made. So the first iteration is never going to be the last one that you make. And most people, when they do a production run, another big production run, say 2 or 3 runs into it, will look at their packaging and go, oh, has there any insights that we've gathered? Has there any trends that changed? Maybe we need to edit something. So the first iteration is never the last.
What's your biggest thrill as a designer seeing a pack out in the wild? If it's on there, is it the retailer's reaction or something else? I love seeing some stuff that we've done, especially if it's come through new design work, it's a change, it's an iteration, all of that sort of stuff, or even a brand new product. I love it. I love going into a store and being like, I get the giddies that it's a product that I've produced and worked with someone and it's on the shelf. What is it for you with that?
I think it's when I can walk into a supermarket and I see somebody in that crucial moment pick up something that I have designed and put it in their trolley. And the wonderful feeling that I get of knowing that I've had some kind of positive influence on that person and their daily, their daily routine. They've gone in, they love the product, and they've picked it up and put it in their trolley. And that is the end game for all of us. That is why we do this. And so that is the most wonderful, wonderful feeling, knowing that I can have some kind of positive influence on people. And the other thing is when, friends of mine or people I know, even like if they're overseas, I had a friend, I walked into a shop in Fiji of all places and looked, and all of a sudden my friend who was with me, she goes, "Oh, didn't you design this?" And I looked and it was the Justine's protein cookies. And I was like, oh my gosh, here they are in Fiji. And so it's really neat to think like all a little piece of your brain is just all around the world being picked up and affecting people and being put into trolleys and being taken home and enjoyed.
So for people who want to find you, Creative Jam, SneekiCo, what's the best place, how to connect with you and your work?
And the best place you can find me is on Instagram, which is creative_jam_NZ. Or with our website, creativejam.co.nz. And SneekiCo is also on Instagram and Facebook and on the web. If you want to buy them, go and buy them in Faro. But also SneekiCo is SneekiCo.co.nz or just SneekiCo for Instagram and Facebook.
Fantastic talking to you. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very, very much.
No problem at all. Loved it.